It's taken months for the Ming Chinese to rouse themselves to the threat of Hideyoshi's Korean invasion. But finally, they're sending troops to Korea. Why did it take so long? And what happened next? That's coming up. Before we get going, don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you like this kind of content. And give this video a thumbs up if you think it deserves it. Toyotomi Hideyoshi began broadcasting his intention to conquer China fully 5 years before he launched his Korean invasion. Starting in 1587, he sent a series of emissaries to Korea to inform the Koreans of his intention to conquer China and to demand their submission. The Koreans initially, and for quite some time, were dumbfounded by this. Hideyoshi's threats seemed like the ravings of a madman, so they didn't take them seriously. They also didn't inform the Ming Chinese. There were a couple of reasons for this. First, Hideyoshi's talk of conquering China was offensive. From the perspective of Joseon Dynasty Korea, a loyal tributary state of Ming China, it was almost sacrilegious. It was sacrilegious. So the Koreans didn't pass on his threats. Second, it was the Koreans' duty to handle the situation rather than just pass it on to Beijing. This was their duty as a Ming buffer state, a part of the service they owed to Ming China. Hideyoshi was an uncivilized barbarian beyond the pale of civilization who was acting up. This is how the Koreans saw him. And it was the Koreans' responsibility to civilize him and ease him into Ming China's orbit. This foreign policy that the Koreans were following was based on the long-standing Chinese policy for dealing with troublesome groups on their borders. It translated roughly as the taming of wild horses and cows. So Beijing never heard about Hideyoshi's threats from the Koreans. The first word they received, in early 1591, instead came from the king of the Ryukyu Islands, who was also being threatened by Hideyoshi. Months pass, and still no word of this threat is received in Beijing from the Koreans. And so the Chinese begin to wonder what's really going on. This growing suspicion about Korea would remain with the Chinese right up through the start of the war. They weren't really paying much attention to Japan and Hideyoshi. They had their eye on Korea. They're thinking, are we being betrayed by our vassal state? So now it's May 1592. Hideyoshi launches his Korean invasion, and his armies begin their lightning-fast advance on Seoul. When news reaches Beijing, the Chinese remain suspicious of the Koreans. They're thinking that the Koreans might actually be helping the Japanese, that they're letting Hideyoshi's armies pass. This suspicion is strengthened by the speed of the Japanese advance, and by the fact that the Koreans still haven't asked for help. Why is that? This seems doubly suspicious. The Koreans have been slow to ask for help from China because they dreaded the consequences. It would mean that Chinese generals and officials would take over and call all the shots. It would also mean opening the door to the Chinese army, a pre-modern mercenary army not nearly as disciplined as armies today. A mass of Chinese troops in Korea might end up being just a different kind of invasion. Thousands of armed men stripping the countryside bare of food, looting, and worse. Finally, however, the Koreans had no choice. With the Japanese closing in on Seoul, the Korean government dispatches an envoy to Beijing to beg China for help. Seoul falls, and a second envoy is sent, then a third. It's only now that the Chinese realize the true situation, that their loyal vassal Korea is fighting for its life, and that a powerful Japanese army is heading their way. So finally, the Ming government starts to act. It orders a token force of 1,000 men into Korea to protect King Sunjo. This unit rendezvous with the retreating king on July 26, 1592, just inside the Korean border, and accompanies him to Uiju as a bodyguard force. It's not until August 8th, however, 2.5 months into the war, that the Chinese government issues the order mobilizing the empire's armed forces. It takes the Chinese that long to get an accurate picture of what's going on in Korea and to fully realize the extent of the threat. The first troops from this mobilization, 5,000 men under General Zhao Chengxun, arrive in Korea later that same month. It will take another 5 months for a larger Ming force to be gathered. This army, consisting of 35,000 men under General Li Rusong, will arrive at Uiju on January 26, 1593. By this time, General Zhao Chengxun has been bloodied. He had ignored the Koreans' warnings and had boldly marched south to Pyongyang, confident that after his years of fighting Mongol tribesmen on the northwest frontier, the Japanese would be easy. "To me," he boasted, "the Japanese robber army will be but a swarm of ants and wasps. They will soon be scattered to the four winds." General Zhao and his army arrived at Pyongyang before dawn on August 23rd. It's dark, and it's raining. They breached one of the gates and caught Konishi Yukinaga's men inside completely off guard, forcing them to fight for their lives. Then, realizing that the attacking force isn't very large, the Japanese began to lure the Chinese into the city's maze of alleys and pick them off. General Chao's bold attack turned into a rout, the Japanese chasing down the survivors and hacking them to pieces on the road leading north. General Zhao himself managed to escape, leaving behind more than half his army killed. He assured the Koreans that it was nothing, only a minor setback. He then wrote up a report on the debacle, absolving himself and blaming the Koreans. Their failure to support him, Zhao wrote, had turned certain victory into defeat. It would be almost 6 months before the Chinese would challenge the Japanese again. In early February 1593, a much larger Chinese army, 43,000 men under General Li Rusong, accompanied by 10,000 Korean government troops and 4,200 Korean monk soldiers, marches south on Pyongyang. Inside the city, the Japanese under Konishi Yukinaga number 15,000. For the first time in the war, the Japanese are badly outnumbered and in serious peril. But there's hope. General Li Rusong has sent a message into the city that Chinese envoys are coming to negotiate a peaceful withdrawal. Konishi sends a party of men out to meet them, and they're ambushed by the Chinese and killed. The following dawn reveals nearly 58,000 enemy troops massing on the frozen ground north of the city. The Chinese and their Korean allies are going to attack. The Second Battle of Pyongyang began in earnest on February 8, 1593, with wave after wave of Chinese and Korean troops storming the walls and cannon fire battering the gates. When the attack falters in the face of withering Japanese musket fire, Li Rusong cuts off the head of one of his own men to encourage the others, and shouts 5,000 liang of silver to the first man inside. Finally, Pyongyang's Chilsong Gate, the 7-star gate, is smashed open and men start pouring inside. The Japanese have prepared for this. They fall back into a fortification of earth and logs that they've built inside. The Chinese and Koreans, confident now that they're winning, rush into attack, only to be cut down by concentrated musket fire. Hundreds are killed, and the rest thrown into retreat. That was the end of the battle. General Li Rusong, realizing that it will cost thousands of lives to dislodge the Japanese from their stronghold, sends a message into Konishi. "My army is quite sufficient to annihilate you," it reads, "but I don't wish to kill so many. I will therefore leave a way open for you to withdraw. Take it and leave at once." It was an offer Konishi couldn't refuse. 2,300 of his men had been killed or wounded that day, and a large portion of his supplies had been captured. Later that night, after the Chinese pull back, the Japanese file out of Pyongyang's south gate, cross the frozen Taedong River, and begin the long march back to Seoul. The retaking of Pyongyang was bittersweet for the Koreans. They have at last started regaining ground, but it's come at the cost of letting China take over. From now on, Chinese generals and Chinese officials will be calling the shots. Korea's own leaders, all the way up to the Prime Minister, Yoo Sung-myung, will be treated like mere assistants by the Chinese. The presence of the Chinese army, as the Koreans feared, was also proving a mixed blessing. In the Second Battle of Pyongyang, for example, there were reports of Ming soldiers cutting off the heads of their Korean allies and turning them in for battle honors. Most aggravating of all, though, was that Li Rusong was now letting the Japanese escape unmolested. Rumors are swirling that he's taken a bribe, that Konishi Yukinaga has given the Chinese general a cash payment to let him go. The Koreans are maddened by this. They don't want to see the Japanese merely pull back. They want to destroy them. After 9 months of death and destruction and humiliation, the Koreans are in a mood of righteous fury. They want revenge.